Hello everyone, today's story is about Hans Schmidt. Hans Schmidt was the first and only priest executed in the United States.
Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
Hans Schmidt was born in the year 1881 in the German Empire, specifically in the Kingdom of Bavaria. His father was a Protestant and his mother was Catholic. He grew up very religious, but many people in his family also suffered from mental health issues. So despite being very religious, Hans would be physically assaulted fairly often by his father. His mother was of no help because she too would also be assaulted. Hans grew up in such a religious yet dysfunctional home that he grew up conflicted between what was right and what was wrong. His family claimed that he had a deep religious devotion, but they also witnessed him dismembering animals. On one occasion, he removed the heads from two of his parents' geese and kept the heads in his pockets. He would also take trips to the village slaughterhouse on a daily basis just so that he could watch the death and dissection of farm animals. His favorite animals to watch die were cows and pigs. He was very obsessed with death. When Hans got older, he lived a bisexual life, even though that went against his religious beliefs. He also had a fascination with drinking blood. His obsessions and religious beliefs grew exponentially. Hans was also amused by Roman Catholic rituals and would perform them often. He would also pretend to be a priest with his very own homemade altar. He also did not like to wear regular clothing. He would dress in typical attire worn by clergymen. His mother would make outfits by hand, and since she was a religious fanatic herself, she was very happy to see her son passionate about her religion. Despite the twisted behavior witnessed by many, Hans was nicknamed the Little Priest. As he got older, Hans decided to attend seminary studies. He started between 1902 and 1903. He studied for about 2 years, and by 1904, Hans eventually began telling people that he was officially a Catholic priest. He claimed that he was ordained by Bishop Kirsten of Mainz on December 23, 1904. Hans would tell people, "The bishop ordained me alone. I do not like to speak of it. The real ordination took place the night before. St. Elizabeth, she ordained me herself. I was praying at my bedside when she appeared to me and said, 'I ordain you to priesthood.' There was light during her appearance. I told no one. They would make fun of me. They always made fun of me for these things. They always expect others to do as they do. God speaks to different people in different ways." The following year, in 1905, Hans was arrested by the Bavarian police. Hans was charged with forging diplomas for failing students. The public prosecutor was adamant about Hans receiving a heavy sentence, but Hans's father hired a lawyer who arranged for the charges to be dropped for reasons of mental defect, and it worked. The charges against Hans were dropped, and he was able to continue preaching as a priest. Hans spent the next 4 years serving in Germany, but there were many disputes with his higher-ups. During parish assignments in different villages, Hans got himself into a lot of mess. He was busted for sexually assaulting altar boys, but was given a chance. He had affairs with several women, but he was still given chances. As if the married women weren't enough, he began looking for women working the streets. His sermons started to get crazier and crazier, so much so that his parishioners and fellow priests complained about him to the Monsignor and the bishop. No other parish assignments were available, or no one was willing to have Hans be the main priest at their church. Hans felt that his only option was to move to America. Hans moved to the United States of America in 1909. His first assignment was at the St. John's Roman Catholic Church in Louisville, Kentucky, but his stay there was short-lived. Hans did not get along with the Catholic leaders in Louisville, so he was forced to relocate to St. Boniface Church on the east side of Midtown Manhattan. Hans was not the only new member to St. Boniface Church. Hans met Aumuller, a housekeeper who was hired to keep up with his living quarters. Anna was born in Austria and had moved to New York the year prior in 1908 when she was 16. Anna was a new employee at St. Boniface, and Hans tried to pursue Anna because he said God spoke to him and ordered him to love Anna. Anna initially refused his advances, but eventually she caved in, and they began a secret sexual relationship. During that same time, Hans was also secretly in a homosexual relationship with a New York City dentist by the name of Ernest Murray. Not only was Hans sleeping with Ernest, but he was also operating a counterfeit ring with him as well. Hans had issues at St. Boniface Church, and just like the previous churches, he was forced out. He was then transferred to St. Joseph's Church in Harlem. Even though he moved, Hans continued his secret sexual relationship with Anna, despite openly admitting that he preferred his sexual relationship with Ernest. Hans later had the bright idea to get married to Anna and to perform the ceremony himself. Anna and Hans had a private wedding ceremony on February 26, 1913, where Hans acted as the priest marrying them and the husband getting married. Hans also wrote their names on a marriage certificate and told Anna that he was going to leave the priesthood for her. Anna referred to Hans as wholly crazy when she spoke with her friends, but she still chose to stick by his side. Months after their secret wedding, things began to fall apart for them. On August 13, 1913, Anna was fired from St. Boniface by Reverend John Braun because he was not satisfied with her way of life. Weeks after being fired, Anna let Hans know that not only was she pregnant, but she had given birth prematurely. Hans got scared. He knew he had been keeping secrets from everyone his whole life, and he thought his secrets were at risk of being exposed, so he made the decision to do something unthinkable so that his secrets would never come to light. On the evening of September 2, 1913, Hans slowly walked towards a sleeping Anna. He used a sharp object on her throat and continued using that sharp object to separate her body into smaller pieces. Over the next few days, Hans made trip after trip from his home to the Hudson River. Each trip, Hans had packages of Anna's body with him, and he would dump it in the Hudson River. When he was all out of Anna, his trips ended. On September 5, 1913, two men were walking along the New Jersey shoreline of the Hudson River. They noticed a package that had been washed up onto the land and decided to investigate. They opened the package and found a headless trunk of a woman. The men were horrified and immediately notified authorities. The very next day in Weehawken, New Jersey, a second package was found. When this package was opened, they found a woman's lower torso wrapped in newspaper that was dated August 31st. The torso and the newspaper were inside of a pillowcase. Investigators in New Jersey noticed that even though the packages were found in New Jersey, they were each weighed down with large pieces of schist, a rock that was not indigenous to New Jersey, but common in Manhattan. Because of this, the case was handed over to the New York City authorities. When New York officials looked into the evidence, they noticed the pillowcase that contained the torso was monogrammed with the letter A. The manufacturer's tag led police to the Newark betting company, Robinson Rotors. Police made their way to Robinson Rotors and requested to see the sales books. The sales books from the firm pointed them in the direction of a storefront on 8th Avenue in Harlem, and it was there that police got their next big lead. The pillowcase was traced back to an order for $12.68. The order was delivered on August 25th to an address that was just around the corner, 68 BRADHURST Avenue. When police arrived at the apartment complex, the landlord informed them that the room in question was newly rented out just 2 weeks prior. Police spoke with the landlord about the autopsy conducted on the body parts found, and they said it concluded that the woman found was in her 20s and weighed between 120 and 130 pounds. Her height was approximately 5 feet 4 inches. The landlord told the police that the occupant was a woman matching that description, but she suddenly disappeared. The apartment was now being rented for her by someone claiming to be a family member, and his name was Hans Schmidt. Police stayed at the apartment complex for a 3-day stakeout in order to make contact with Hans Schmidt, but no one ever entered the apartment. Detective Farrow ordered Detective Frank Casasa to break into the apartment. Inside the apartment, there was blood everywhere. The walls and floors were saturated with blood, despite attempts to scrub the crime scene. There were 6 bars of soap found in the sink that Hans used to do the scrubbing. Detective Joseph opened a trunk, and inside were letters addressed to Anna. Some letters were from Hans mentioning his employment at St. Joseph's, a cloth with the same monogrammed A on it, and a 12-inch sharp weapon. A handsaw was also in the trunk, and both objects had been recently cleaned. Everything in the trunk was evidence that linked Hans to Anna. The room reeked of blood, but detectives had what they needed to make an arrest. Police left the apartment to go find Father Hans Schmidt. Detective Joseph and his homicide detectives made their way to St. Joseph's Church on September 13, 1913. Detective Farrow and Detectives Casassa and O'Connell arrived at St. Joseph's Church at 1:30 in the morning. After Detective Joseph Farrow pounded on the door, the senior pastor, Father Daniel Quinn, opened the door, led them into the parlor, and woke Hans up. He asked all of them to wait in a small office, and he would bring Hans to them. Hans finally arrived, and when he entered the room, he was made aware of who they were and why they were there. Detectives documented that he fell into a shocked hush before blurting out a confession. He cried and screamed while giving his confession, "I killed her, I killed her." In the confession, he said he killed Anna because he loved her and she was sacrificed. He said he was guilty and ready to pay the penalty. Media was all over this case. Hans let media know that he had a disturbed psyche that could be traced back to his childhood. He talked about his obsessions growing up and how he was infatuated with blood. Investigators ended up finding business cards with the name Dr. Emil Aumuller on it, and when he was questioned about it, he confessed to posing as a surgeon before. There was also information found that tied him to the money counterfeiting plot in Harlem and an insurance scam with a fake doctor where the two would murder cripples and paralytics among his parishioners. It is unclear who this fake doctor was, but Hans insisted that he was fulfilling God's will. It turned out that Anna was not his first victim. The trial for Hans began on December 7, 1913. He admitted that he was guilty, but he was insane and should not be convicted. 23 days after trial began, 2 jury members agreed with his insanity claim, and the trial ended in a hung jury with a vote of 10-2. During the second trial, which began on January 19, 1914, Hans's defense attorneys were again focusing on the insanity defense. When his lawyers were talking to jurors about how insane he was, Hans jumped out of his seat, shouting that what they were saying was not true. There was nothing his lawyers could do after that. The judge presiding over the case, Judge Vernon Davis, strongly advised the jury about letting this second trial end like the first. He was quoted saying, "Use your common sense, your experience with men. Bear in mind, it isn't every form of mental unsoundness that excuses a crime." For the second trial, there was a unanimous decision. The jury found Hans guilty of first-degree murder, and they recommended he be sentenced to death. The judge agreed with the jury's recommendation, and he was sentenced to death by method of electrocution. Hans was transferred to Sing Sing prison in New York. Hans was executed on February 18, 1916, in the electric chair, 2 years after being found guilty of murder. Before being executed, he said, "I ask forgiveness of all those I have injured or scandalized." After being executed, he was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. Hans died just over 1 year before the United States of America entered World War I against Germany. To date, Hans Schmidt has been the only Catholic priest executed in the United States. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. Let me know what you guys think of this story in the comments below.